Hello and welcome to this episode of The Nudge. Today I'll be chatting about the psychology behind segments like millennials and discussing how valuable they may or may not be. I'm joined again by Richard Shotton for this discussion. Richard is the author of The Choice Factory, the best-selling book on applying behaviour science to advertising. It contains 25 biases that most consumers fall foul to. Learn them and you'll learn how to effectively influence your market. Richard and I started this discussion by chatting about something we hear often from marketing gurus. It's the idea that consumers are constantly changing. But is it true? Are the millennials of today drastically different from the baby boomers of the 60s? I'll hand over to Richard to start the discussion.
So I think the first thing you mentioned was around this idea that is prevalent in marketing of consumers in 2019 being very different from they were 10, 15, 30 years ago. And I think a lot of the evidence from social psychology would dispute that of course there have been societal change, of course there have been technological changes, of course there have been economic changes, but the fundamental motivations of people are remarkably similar. There's a lovely Bernbach quote along the lines of, it's taken millions of years for human nature to develop, it will take millions of years for it to vary. It's fashionable to talk about the changing man, but as communicators, we should be concerned with the unchanging man. Now, Bernbach's timescale might be a bit skew-if there, but the core point that he makes, the underlying motivations that people have, whether it's for status or to appeal to others or to protect their family, those things are fundamentally the same as they were. And one of the reasons for writing the book really was that people kept on talking about the changing consumer. And what I wanted to show was that the experiments that psychologists have done back, as far back as the 1890s, still work today just as strongly as they did back then. So one of the big motivations for writing the book was to try and show that the findings from psychology are still relevant today, even if they were done 50 or 100 years ago.
Behavioural science consistently shows that consumers today, whether they be millennials or not, still behave pretty similarly to those of 50 to even 100 years ago. Yes, much about the consumer's environment has changed, but fundamentally the makeup of their brain is still the same. Richard Shotton explains this eloquently in his book. He references a story that almost all psychologists will know: the death of Kitty Genovese. Now, Kitty's story is pretty bleak. At 3:20 a.m, March 13th, 1964, she was walking home. A few yards before getting to her door, a man approached and plunged a knife into her back. Now, deaths in New York in 1964 weren't very rare, but this specific case shocked the city. Why? Because for half an hour, 38 law-abiding New York citizens heard Kitty get attacked and subsequently murdered. Yet none of these 38 people called the police. While the newspapers took this as proof that people of the 60s were less humane than ever, psychologists took a different view. They believed that no one intervened because of the sheer volume of witnesses. Everybody assumed someone else would call the police, so they didn't bother picking up the phone themselves. It's called the bystander effect. It's since been proven in more recent studies. For example, you're less likely to investigate smoke coming from a nearby room if you're sitting with a group of strangers. The effect is over 50 years old now, but would it still apply to the millennials of today? Richard would argue it does. In 2018, he was attempting to improve the NHS Give Blood campaign. You may have heard me reference this on a previous podcast. Essentially, the NHS's ads weren't specific enough. They claimed that blood stocks were low across the UK, but Richard feared viewers wouldn't notice them because they weren't directed at a specific audience. Essentially, the ads were suffering from this same bystander effect. So Richard edited the ads to specifically appeal to the viewer. Instead of the ad saying stocks are low across the UK, they would say stocks are low in the specific location the viewer was in, whether that was London, Manchester, or Birmingham, for example. That 50-year-old rule still applies today. Even with the smartphones and the social networks and everything that's different today, that rule still applied. And perhaps this shows that consumers really haven't changed much at all. I'll let Richard talk about another experiment he looked at in his book and how it's still prevalent today.
often what we do in the book is sometimes we do completely new experiments. Sometimes they are twists on existing experiments. And the existing experiment that was based on was one by Darley and Batson, two Princeton psychologists. And they did this wonderful experiment back in 1973 where they recruited 40 trainee priests. And they said to them, look, what we want you to do is go 5 minutes walk down the road to a nearby church, and you're going to go and give a sermon. But the experiment begins as those priests are leaving. And what Batson and Darley did was say to them, just as they're about to leave, half of them were told, oh gosh, you're running late, you better hurry. They're expecting you 5 minutes ago. The other group were told, oh, you're a bit early, but you might as well head on down there. You can hang around till they're ready for you. So first group are put in a rush, second group are in the low hurry condition. And then as those people are walking to the church, the psychologists have got one of their colleagues to act as a kind of stooge, and he's pretending to have breathing difficulties. So he's slumped up against a wall. And the real experiment was what proportion of people would stop and help that man. And what the psychologists found was that when people are in a rush, only about 10% of them stopped, whereas when they had plenty of time, 63% of them stopped.
I think that's a really significant finding. Essentially, people who are part of a very specific socio-economic group, in this case priests, acted extremely differently when the context was changed. When they took their time, 64% of priests helped, but when they were in a rush, only 10% helped. I'm sure that most of us would assume that priests in general probably react and act in similar ways, but they don't. Their behaviour changes dramatically based on the context. So why, as marketers, should we ever assume that a group like millennials would act and react in the same way with our ads, especially when they're far less specific than a group like priests? I'll pass back to Richard, who goes on to explain why it is so difficult to group people by their attributes or their job role.
Now, what was interesting was that the psychologists beforehand had also questioned people about their motivations for going into the church. Was it that they were there to glorify God, or was it to help their fellow man? And they found that those personality attributes had no significant effect on whether people stopped or not. Whether or not people said that they were doing it to help other people, that was not an indicator of whether they'd stop and help. But whether they're in a rush or not was a much better guide. Now, when people were asked to estimate what they thought would be the most important effect, most people assumed it would be the personality metric, and that whether they were in a rush would have minimal effect. So what Laura McLean and I did was, in 2016, we created a thought experiment, a much simpler one, just to see if that error of estimation about people's behaviour still stood. So we said to people, given this story about someone being slumped and ill, and we said, who do you think is more likely to stop? Someone who is generous in a rush, or someone who is not so generous but has plenty of time? And people overwhelmingly thought it would be the personality. 81% of people thought it was the appropriate personality that would stop. Only 19% thought it would be someone who had much more time. Now, what Darley and Batson defined this as, they called it the fundamental attribution error. And that has two main aspects. Firstly, that context is phenomenally important in shaping behaviour. But above and beyond that is that we tend to underestimate the importance of context. And I think that underestimation occurs still in marketing today.
Context is clearly more important than we'd initially suspect. Yet very few marketers seem to think about the context their messages will be seen in. In fact, these findings suggest that context actually outweighs the consumer's socio-economic group when it comes to decision making. Fundamentally, consumers are more likely to notice your ad if they're not in a rush, regardless of whether they're a millennial or not. And a more recent study from Fred Bronner links nicely with this fact. In 2007, Fred asked 1,287 participants to read through a newspaper. He then asked them which of the ads they remembered. Unlike most recall tests, he categorized the results by the reader's mood. Those in a positive or good mood noticed 56% of the ads. Those in a negative mood noticed just 36%. This finding is staggering because in this scenario, mood seemed to be the biggest driver for ad recall, regardless of whether the ad was targeted at a male or female, millennials, or even a priest. The key driver for recall was a person's mood, not their attributes.
Because one of the things people often say is, oh, well, isn't this kind of rather obvious? And what you think is, well, it doesn't matter whether when we are sitting just in a podcast or when we're having an intellectual debate, or sorry, that's a bit highfalutin, but when we're having a abstract debate, it might seem obvious. But what matters is that insight being used on a day-to-day basis? And I think the best test of that, one that has quite a definitive answer, is think back. If you work at an agency or you work in a marketing department, think back to all the briefs you either create or receive. Now, I would wager every single one of those briefs has a target audience on it. But what proportion has a target context? A rounding error, maybe 1 or 2%. So even if people say theoretically that they believe this, they're not acting on it in their kind of day-to-day life. I think the second way of maybe seeing that this problem is think of something like programmatic advertising. Hugely important area, growing massively. But the way it's currently used is often to commoditize people. So we kind of think, well, an ABC, one woman, is the same whatever circumstance she's in. A CEO is the same whatever circumstance they're in. It's the audience that matters, and therefore we're going to buy that audience regardless of where they are. Now, the danger with that is what it often means is you reach, let's say, keep the CEO example, or a car buyer, you reach them not when they are in the mindset of being a CEO, not when they're on some highfalutin website about finance, or not when they're actually on Autocar or Auto Trader looking at a car. You reach them at a different moment because it's often far cheaper. Now, if all you believe in is in the importance of the target audience, then that is a very sensible saving. If you believe context is something very important, well, by reaching that person in a different mood, in a different state, in a different mindset, then suddenly there is a trade-off happening. Now, it's not to say that trade-off isn't worth it, but we're deluding ourselves if we don't think there is some cost to what we're doing.
As Richard said, most marketing campaigns target audience segments rather than the context the audience might be in. The problem with these segments, like millennials for example, is they just don't predict much. Often they are developed by a creative focus group exercise rather than a hard analysis of data. After all, can we really believe that all millennials act the same when the group encompasses everyone from a 39-year-old father of 4 to a 16-year-old aspiring ballet dancer? In reality, past behaviour is much more likely to predict future behaviour. In other words, a person who was regularly late to work last week will probably be late next week, or a person who's in a rush is less likely to stop and help someone. This is regardless of the segment they may be in. To flesh this out, I'll provide an example from David Halpern's book, Inside the Nudge Factory. His team managed to improve the amount of people who paid their tax on time by 15%. The way they did this is by utilising social proof. They wrote a brand new letter which basically just said that most people paid their tax on time, promoting social proof and getting 15% more people to pay their tax. What's interesting is this nudge was found to be effective across all of the traditional popular segments. Millennials, baby boomers, Generation X all behaved in the required way. There was no significant discrepancy in how each of the groups responded to the messages. So are there campaigns that looked beyond traditional segments and actually considered the context a consumer was in? I asked Richard for an example.
Often it's harder to see externally because you are not aware whether the context you've received an ad is what everyone else is receiving it in, or you're a one-off. So it's often more invisible. But some examples of times I've certainly used it, from the kind of the smaller to the larger one, things like going really executional now, but we had worked with a beer brand a while ago who had humorous ads, so it was Coors Light, and one of the things that we did was know that there was work done by Zhang and Zakan to University, I think, of Houston psychologists, where they had shown that the same ad is funnier if it is seen in a group rather than if you watch it on your own. Possibly something to do with social proof here, that if we see other people laughing, we get caught up in the mood. We think it's funnier because someone else has judged it to be amusing. So the simple thing there is, well, when you're buying your TV spots, you don't just rate and pick your programs based on their conversions to target audience. Well, that still remains something that's important, but you also look at what programs are likely to be viewed in groups, and all that data is easily available to an advertiser. So, for example, films are much more likely to be watching a group than other types of TV. So, it can certainly happen. It's often harder for external people, I think, to realise it's happening.
So if you hear somebody talking about finding success by targeting millennials, baby boomers, or even soccer mums, scrutinise their work a bit more. And when you're working on your next campaign, don't assume that consumers you're going after are constantly changing. Most of the time, they're pretty predictable. Unfortunately, most of us don't realise this. Way back in 1996, Anton Ducrain reviewed 12 studies and found conclusively that red painkillers are more effective. The red colour draws connotations with strength and power, and via the placebo effect actually made the drug more potent. Now, brands like Nurofen, Advil and Panadol spend millions advertising and promoting their drugs. So you'd think all of the brands would have taken advantage of this simple nudge. It was found way back in 1996. But they don't. Only 1 out of the top 10 selling painkillers in the UK are actually red. Anyway, that's it from me today. If you've enjoyed listening to Richard, I highly recommend purchasing his book, The Choice Factory. It's an up-to-date look at the latest insights from consumer psychology and contains heaps of practical ideas that you could apply to your marketing. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Nudge.